Chapter 6. For a dozen miles north of Castle Gate, the trail wound over the tumbling hills. Then the trees started, scattered pinyon-laden onto clumps, and then long lines of red-trunked bull pine. Beyond rose the mountains, abrupt, slashing up and fanged with yellow crags. If Pat was able to identify the chief features of Apache Cache without difficulty from Clay Marble's tense description, he was totally unprepared for the effect of this wild, remote, and beautiful country. Topping a last brushy swell across the sun-flushed heights, he looked down a long rocky slope across which the faint wagon trail twisted towards the bottom. Down there the boulders and granite dikes increased in size, rose in monoliths and spears, until his eye plunged through a lofty cliff-based getaway. This was the entrance of the cache. The sullen red rocks, raising higher above his head as he descended, cut off his view and lent a sinister air of solitude to this place. Reaching the gateway at last, Pat hauled in for a long, incredulous look about the portals. Beyond the rocky battlements, a spacious and cup-like valley opened out 2 or 3 miles wide at a rough estimate, with a picturesque fringe of willow and aspen edging the streams which threaded down through the center. Lofty pines clumped the base of lifting, obscure spurs capped with rock and hemming in the valley. In almost every direction the shadowy breaks of canyons fanning away from this central valley could be made out. Sage covered the open reaches of the cache, and save for a young deer bounding away as he appeared, Pat saw little sign of life. The cattle range, he gathered, must lay beyond the canyons, but even here there was a deep, sunken prints of steer hooves in a dusty trail, and beyond the creek brush he made out a sagging roof of several weathered buildings. Rounding the end of a plastered log shack a few minutes later, he discovered 3 or 4 roughly clad men who must have been easily mistaken for mountaineers standing about the door. Whatever they had been lazily discussing was forgotten as Pat came into sight. A dead silence, their dark faces swiveled towards him, and hard glances fixed. Each appeared a giant in size, and all were heavily armed. After a deliberate pause, one of them stepped forward from a shambled gate. The chilly eyes probed Pat's face. "What are you after here, stranger?" came harshly from the bearded lips. "This is a dead-end road." "Good morning," Pat nodded, allowing a fleeting smile to touch his lips. "Perhaps you could point out the way to Press Moon's place for me? I've never been in there before." "Axehead Canyon?" the man said without inflection. He seemed in no hurry, rolling the request over in his mind. "What would you be wanting there?" "Well, I want to see Moon, of course," Pat returned civilly. "Tell him nothing, Labe," called one of the men around the door, a gruff warning. "Moon ain't looking for no visitors. Turn that bird back and send him packing." Pat knew that these must be the Mormons, probably elder sons since none were over 30, from homes in the upper canyons leading into the cache. Gathered here to idle and talk, they were presumably expected to act as guards as well. One or more might even have been involved in the recent shooting affair in Castle Gate. It was no wonder if they were inclined to look askance against strangers appearing here. "Look," Pat's easy talk included them all reasonably. "I know some of you boys had some trouble in town. I had no part in that, no interest in it, and haven't now. Show me how to reach Moon's Canyon, and I'll be on my way." Still the big man stood, regarding Pat sourly. It was manifest from his inflexible expression that he extended to yield to nothing. "No," he began finally, a hand moving towards his waist. "I guess not. You don't belong here, stranger, and that's final." Pat didn't intend to force a quarrel with these men. There was no assurance of how it might come out for him, even if he did. He was groping for some means of coping with the awkward situation when a distraction occurred. Hooves thudded faintly, and the Mormons looked away across the brush. Turning in the saddle, Pat saw a girl riding forward. An instant later, his hopes rose afresh as he recognized Esther Moon. The grace and ease with which she swept close and reined in bespoke her complete familiarity with horses. "Good afternoon, Laban," she greeted the man facing Pat, and then her glance turned towards the latter. "And how are you?" She nodded, smiling. Pat made reserved acknowledgment, but it was the man who called Laban who spoke abruptly, stabbing a finger at Stephen. "You know this hombre, Miss Moon?" he demanded bluntly. "Do I know him?" Esther managed a slight surprise. "Why, of course, Laban. Why do you ask?" "Well, he rode in here asking for your dad. I think he's a spy." The fellow drove on doggedly. "And even if he ain't, there's no harm in sending him on his way. Your dad's got all the hands he needs, and we don't need no good drifters piling in here." This brand of uncompromised rejection was beginning to get under Pat's hide. Before he could speak out, the girl interposed quietly and firmly. "I'll vouch for him in the present case, Laban Brush," she said with a quiet decision. "What is more, I'll accompany him to the ranch. You can relieve your minds upon it." Her cool assurance daunted the Mormon. Clearly, these men were at once admired and distrusted her somewhat, but Esther's resolute was something they couldn't succeed withstanding. "Well, if you say so, I guess it's all right," Brush said unwillingly. Pat took the hint and turned his horse towards the girl without meeting the other man's lowered regard, and he rode away from the shack. It apparently served as a store at her side, careful to show no undue haste. "Well, that was decent of you," he said once they had gone beyond earshot. "I was afraid I might have to tangle with those boys for a minute." "Oh, they're not bad," Esther assured hastily. "They're all Brush cousins, most of them. They have their little particular ways, and of course they have to be careful." "I know, but if you hadn't spoken up, they would have turned mean on me, all the same." A faint color touched the girl's smooth cheeks. "It was nothing. I remembered you from the store, Mr. Stevens. You can't refuse a small return for your favor." "You know my name?" Pat caught her up. "I asked Clay who you were." Her color deepened. "I see." Pat glanced at her thoughtfully. "No point in telling those fellows that I'm a friend of Myrtle's." "Do I understand you know father, Mr. Stevens?" She thrust in hurriedly. "Well, that's the point. I hope to. I rode out with the idea of getting acquainted. You don't expect he'd mind?" Her face grew troubled. "But I don't see—" "Well, Miss Moon, I've no axe to grind," he laughed. "You'll think maybe I had going to Axe Canyon, though. It's just that I missed Moon in town, and his slant on things will be interesting." "What things?" "Well, that depends," he grinned, "on what he's willing to talk about. I haven't got any idea about twisting his arm." "I'm afraid he won't care to talk about anything, Mr. Stevens." She seemed to draw herself in, creating a cloak of reserve. "You can see him, of course, but matters have come up which have not left him overly cheerful, and he's probably apt to show it." Reflecting how pretty she was with her neatly coiled brown hair and hazel eyes, Pat nodded. He managed to start her talking about other things, and they were progressing almost gaily by the time she turned into a canyon mouth choked with pines, and they struck into a well-worn trail. Narrow at the mouth, this craggy canyon opened out into a windy, grassy, pine-garnished valley. A mile farther on, cattle began to appear, bearing a big, splotched M-bar brand. And then Pat saw the trim ranch buildings clustered on a bench. "Mighty pretty place for a spread here. No danger of the cattle straying either," he commented. "They do, though, or something happens to them," she replied briefly. "There's father over there." She indicated a man working about the corrals and deliberately swung away as Pat headed in that direction. Waving a smiling goodbye to her, he pushed on. Press Moon was waiting for him when he rode up. "Well," he said dryly without any preliminaries, "who are you?" Pat introduced himself. "I was in town and happened to overhear your little difficulty at the bank, Moon. Not that I'm here to talk about that," he began. "Then what are you here about?" There was a respectable look about the rancher which belied his crusty words. Circumstances had gathered about him, Pat knew, which would excuse much. "Oh, nothing serious. I hone for a slant on this range that doesn't depend entirely on, well, shall we say, plumb bob views." "Well, you won't get it here, Stevens," Press retorted curtly. "Sorry you had to come so far for nothing." He paused. "Didn't you run into nobody at all down in the cache?" Platt explained the manner in which the Mormons had attempted to turn him back. Knowledge of his daughter's part in the matter only brought a flush to Moon's tightly clamped jaw. "They know you're in here, eh? I'll take it kindly, Stevens, if you'll pull off my ranch without wasting any time. No more talk." He denied sharply when Pat would have spoken. "I ain't got a thing against you or a thing for you. Just save yourself the trouble, Stevens, and go." "But a man can't hurt you any to talk a little," Pat reiterated, in some mystification over such relentless stubbornness. "I don't want any of your secrets. You don't even know what my interests lie in." He caught Moon's wary glance straying about the canyon, as though looking for something or someone, and when he glanced that way himself, a rider broke into view to come pounding down forward in haste. It wasn't Esther Moon. It was a man, and he looked big and purposeful. "You can turn up through them pines there," Moon was saying grimly, "and work on over the ridge. That'll take you out of the canyons. You going peaceably, Stevens, or—" There was an edge in his voice, and Pat heeded it. It would prove easier to make his peace later with Moon if a third man was not witnessing to their bickering now. "I'll go," he nodded. "Sorry we can't make this up, Moon. Maybe later. I won't hold your manners against you." Press's snort reached him as he shoved his horse into the pines back in the corral and began to work upward. It was 20 minutes later, and he was climbing halfway up the canyon wall before he decided that he wasn't being pursued. Seeking an upthrust spur and reconnoiter with care, he revealed no disposition to leave the canyon. The truth was that something about this whole setup frankly bothered him. Sam's comments by now were a rank understatement. The deeper Pat bore into conditions here, the more deeply interested he became. Why should Press Moon prove so close-mouthed? Surely he must have something to conceal. It occurred to Pat that the rancher feared his Mormon friends might learn of his enforced dealings with Doc Marble, their foe. Whatever their object, the Plum Bob cattle baron was adamantly not extending his benevolence to include them. Pat shook his head then. If concealment was Moon's preliminary purpose, he must understand that stubborn silence would prove more revealing in the end than any amount of smooth talk. Something else was afoot here. Something which he didn't want Pat or anyone else to see. Arriving at that point, Pat made his decision swiftly. He would look this canyon over with care before he went further, and he began to work along the ridge, careful to avoid accidental observation and scanning the canyon's depths from time to time with attention. It struck him presently that Moon's supply of stock was notably scanty, if what he saw comprised more than a small fraction of the herd. Searching out a branch canyon and some rocky pocket as presented themselves along the rock wall, he soon ascertained that his original suspicion was correct. Press Moon was, in fact, dangerously low on steers. Afternoon shadows were slanting outward and across, and Pat was climbing out of the canyon for the last time, having seen no one, when a thin billowing dust cloud hovered above a notch a half a mile to the west that drew his attention. His nerves slowly tightened up as he watched. This, he knew at once, was what he had been looking for all along. Working that way with some greater caution than before, He came to the point where it seemed advisable to tie up his horse and go on afoot. From tree to rock he slipped, the bawl and flinty chatter of herded steers growing in his ears. They were being driven through a narrow defile forming a hidden entrance to Axe Head Canyon, and Pat read what this meant. At last the click and thud of hooves and horns sounded almost beneath him, and dust swirled thick through the brush where he crouched. He crawled out onto a broken ledge and peered over and down. The trail was directly below, and over it poured a steady stream of tormented steers in a single file, their eyes rolling and tongues lolling. Clearly they were being driven hard and far. Pat's pupils slinted as he made out the brand on their flanks. Every steer bore an unmistakable 7 hook. "Well, you can quit hunting, Clay," he reflected bleakly as he ducked back and lay motionless against the rock, while a cursing rider crowded his horse past below, prodding the stock along. "Well, I found your steers just about where I had a notion they'd be." A few moments passed, and then a further thought prompted him to abandon the spot in some haste and clamber back to his pony. A few moments later, a further thought prompted him to abandon the spot in some haste and clamber back to his horse. 10 minutes later, from a safer vantage point, he was guardedly watching the cattle being driven up the canyon to disappear at last beyond the concealed wall of pines. Soberly, Pat guided his horse down towards the canyon's bed. Still not wholly abandoning the cover of the trees, he made it directly as possible to Moon's ranch. Plottering about the rear of the house like a man with something on his mind, Press looked up with a jerk when Pat pushed through the pine scrub into the open a few yards away. "You again?" he burst out in exasperation. "Damn it, Stevens, I won't have to stand for your gull." His trembling hand was fumbling for his waist. "I just wanted to tell you those 7-hook steers got here all right," Pat interjected levelly, cutting off the flow of angry bile. "I know you were expecting them. They've been driven up the canyon now." "So you know that." Moon gestured helplessly. "Well, I tried. I can't do no more." Some of the blood had deserted his dusky cheeks, the bristling mustache darker by contrast. "Maybe it would simplify matters if you told me your real trouble," Pat suggested flatly. "It's money, Stevens. It's short, like always," Press groaned. "I'm scared to death of not being able to hang on here. Henry LeBlanc at the bank always was hard enough to deal with. This last time he threw me out and refused to even talk to me. Then Marble said it was a mistake and he offered me those steers on shares. Wouldn't even take my note. You won't tell them, though, down there in the Apache cache?" "No, I won't say anything there." Moon appeared to miss the significance of this, occupied as he was with his harassed thoughts. I can't understand it yet, though. I always considered Doc Marble my enemy. Was I that far wrong?" Pat drawled. "Well, I wouldn't swear he's your friend, even right now." "Why not?" Press demanded, looking at him sharply. "Because I happen to know those 7-hook steers were rustled down in from the Pecos territory, and Billy Boone sold them to Plum Bob for a song. The way it looks now, with the stock detective up here tracing them, Marble's decided to move them off his range, and that's your business, Favor." It hit so hard Moon had no thought of questioning the news. His dejection was complete, his thin visage grown longer than ever. "And I walked right into it. Damn Marble's hide. Now I'm in a real soup," he said, striving to keep his head, not entirely succeeding. "What'll I do now, Stevens?" "Nothing yet." Pat was almost cheerful. "It'll help a lot if you take me on faith and don't go off half-cocked. It's just possible," he proceeded levelly, "that I know more about this business than a lot of people suspect. I'll go on poking around. Meanwhile, you guard those steers careful, Moon, Don't let anyone know about 'em, and we'll see what we can figure out. End of chapter 6.